Hello and welcome to this event at the Ilkley Literature Festival, organised together with the Centre for World Literatures at the University of Leeds. My name is Richard Hibbitt and I will be chairing the event. And I'd like to introduce two of my colleagues from the university, Sarah Hudspith, specialist in Russian literature, and Olivia Santovetti, specialist in Italian literature, who will be talking about two authors from different periods and also from different cultures. And what we wanted to do with this event, as you can see with the title Illuminating the Chaos and Obscurity, is to put both Ferrante and Dostoevsky into dialogue with one another. And for the first part of this event, the pre-recorded part, we're going to have a PowerPoint presentation which you'll be able to follow as you listen to the discussion. And in the second part, we'll be very happy to take questions from the audience and have a further discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk about the rationale behind this particular dialogue.
Thank you very much, Richard. I wanted to do this event because I was introduced to Elena Ferrante by Olivia as a result of a university module that we teach on together. And when I read Ferrante's novels, I found that they gripped me and grabbed me in a way that the work of no other author has done since the first time I read Dostoevsky. And the more I read Ferrante, the more I was really seized by these fantastic novels and by the world that she creates and represents. And not only that, I also found that there were so many themes that Ferrante explores that I found were really similar to those that Dostoevsky also treats in his novels. And so I thought that it would be a really good way of understanding this kind of similarity by having a conversation with Olivia to discuss these different similarities. This year, 2021, is also the 200th anniversary of Dostoevsky's birth. So I thought it would be not only a good way to explore these similarities, but also a good time to consider the lasting impact and legacy of Dostoevsky's novels.
I'm Olivia Santovetti, and I want to thank Richard for the introduction and Sarah for proposing the event. And also, I want to thank the Ilkley Literature Festival for making it possible. It is great to collaborate again with the festival. I still remember the Ferrante Fever in Leeds that we organized together in 2016 in our campus. But when Sarah came up with this idea of a parallel reading of Dostoevsky and Ferrante, I was struck by how timely and how promising this was going to be. For the many fascinating resonance that Sarah has just highlighted and we are going to discuss today, but also because I really felt that the Ferrante fever, this addictive, involving reading experience was so similar, I would say identical to my experience of reading Dostoevsky when I was younger. So I literally spent one summer devouring one tome after another. I couldn't stop, so a fever. So this is what happens with Dostoevsky and with Ferrante. They literally grab the attention of the readers. They pull you right in. They're masters of pulling the readers into the story and into the mind of the character. So Ferrante acknowledges the depth of Dostoevsky in several places, and we might show the first slide. And here in this slide, you see that in My Brilliant Friend, it is by discussing Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov that Ellen and Nino start courting each other. And I'm reading from the slide. She says, I asked him what he was reading. I told him what I was reading. We talk about our reading. So Dostoevsky's book is a matchmaker. It's the intermediary which brings the two characters together over their passion for reading and reading Dostoevsky. But it also what separates the characters from the others. See, always in the quote, see Marisa, who is clearly excluded, and she's annoyed and busting, shouting, stop it. Who cares about this Dostoevsky? Who gives a damn about the Karamazov? But of course, Ferrante does care about the Karamazov. And this is something on which Sarah can illuminate us.
Yes, so thank you, Olivia. I think it's really interesting that Ferrante chooses this particular novel to be that that stimulus for the relationship between Elena and Nino. It's Dostoevsky's last novel. It's also his longest novel, and many might say his most sophisticated novel. Because what it does is that it reflects upon the nature of telling stories. So many of the characters within the Brothers Karamazov tell their own stories, and within the telling of the stories, they reflect upon the power of stories and also their competing nature. And it's some of these issues that we're going to touch upon as we go throughout this this discussion.
So if I can add to this, what Sarah has observed about the Brothers Karamazov, now a novel about writing, also a polyphonic novel, is really echoed by Ferrante herself in a passage from Frantumaglia. So we pass to the next slide. Frantumaglia is the volume which collects Ferrante's letters, essay, and interviews. And you can see in this passage that by speaking of Dostoevsky, Ferrante reveals some of the traits in common between them. So writing as a tension between order and chaos, or stories as polyphony of voices. And finally, this idea of the unfiltered, which Dostoevsky, see the last sentence, is able to pour into his works. Now, this unfiltered, this raw material, is also Ferrante's trademark. Now, her writing has often been described as brutally honest, shockingly honest, unnervingly blunt. I'm reading just some quotes. So, pouring the unfiltered with audacity could well describe her own style. I was just paraphrasing the Ferrante's passage. So, let's see the first quote of the next slide. And here you can see Ferrante writes, she says, "When I write, it's as if I were butchering eels. I pay little attention to the unpleasantness of the operation and use the plot, the characters as a tight net to pull up from the depths of my experience everything that is alive and driving, including what I myself have driven away as far as possible because it seemed unbearable." And this is not only a matter of content. For example, the messiness of female friendship or the taboo of maternal love. So not only a matter of content, but also a matter of language and style. See the second quote. Now, the labor and the pleasure of truthful narration supplant any other concern, including a concern with formal elegance. And she continues, "I belong to the categories of writers who throw out the final draft and keep the rough. Keep the rough when this practice ensures a higher degree of authenticity." And they say that the last quote also tells a similar thing. Now, beautiful writing doesn't interest me. Writing interests me. And this resonates with Dostoevsky, doesn't it, Sarah?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely, Olivia. So Dostoevsky's narrators are very much have this this concern with trying to write authentically and how that interacts with the editing process that you might expect from a writer. So many of Dostoevsky's narrators in his novels are writers of different kinds. Some of them are professional writers, they're novelists or journalists, but whether or not they are professional writers as you know as part of their character, the vast majority of them turn to writing. They turn to writing the text that we as readers are reading, mainly in order to make sense of some kind of tumultuous events that that have happened to them recently. But as they write, as they put down the events that have happened to them on the page, the pages that we are reading, they also reflect on what they should do with those notes. And as you can see here, we've got two examples which are very similar. One comes from Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot. This is the comment of a young character who produces a manuscript that he reads in a most pretentious way at a social gathering. And he says, and he reads this out as well, I can't help feeling that I've just written something terribly stupid. But as I said, I've no time to correct anything. Besides, I promised deliberately not to correct a single line in this manuscript, even though I notice that I'm contradicting myself every few lines. And then we have something very similar in the novel The Adolescent, where at the end, as the narrator Arkady reviews what he's just written, there's a similar kind of awareness that what he's written is not very good, just like in The Idiot. But he's not going to change it anyway. I regret a great deal I've written, especially the tone of certain sentences and pages, but I will not cross them out or correct a single word. So they don't want to, they feel that that authenticity comes from just this unpolished, unedited manuscript, very similar to what Ferrante says about keeping the rough draft and throwing out the polished version.
And if I may add to this, the search for authenticity voiced by Dostoevsky's characters, Dostoevsky's narrators, as Sarah has pointed out, is also embraced by Ferrante's narrators. And so if we see in the next slide, Elena Greco, the narrator of the Neapolitan novels, wishes she could write the way Lila speaks. I'm reading the quote, leave abysses, construct bridges and not finish them, force the reader to establish the flow. So to leave abysses and force the reader to establish the flow means to expose the reader to, and then move on to the second quote, to the first knowledge of the terror. Now this is this can happen only in flashes, only for an instant. And for this experience is well known. Ferrante has invented a word, smarginatura. And we can move on to the next slide. And Goldstein has translated smarginatura with dissolving margins. So the prefix S in Italian is like this in English and Latin, and counteropposes the action of the verb. So smarginatura is a sensation of reality losing its margins, collapsing, showing in its brutality what it really is, and leaving the subject traumatized, exhausted. And all women characters in the Ferrante's fiction have experienced in full the stabilizing effect of the smarginatura. This is the thing happening. I'm just now reading some parts of the quote. Now, this is the thing happening to Lila at the New Year's party in Volume 1, when the beloved outline of a brother loses consistency, breaks down his outlines, and, I'm quoting again, the matter expanded like a magma, showing her what he was truly made of. Now, similar flashes of illumination, also traumatic, of course, are experienced by Dostoevsky's characters. But it is not really the same, is it, Sarah?
No, it's interesting. I would say that there are two kind of possible analogies in Dostoevsky for this phenomenon of smarginatura. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see an example taken from The Idiot. This is to do with the aura that epileptics sometimes describe experiencing preceding one of their seizures. Dostoevsky himself suffered from epilepsy, and many of the characters that he created in his novels also suffer from epilepsy. And so this is the description of the Idiot's main character, Prince Muishkin, experiencing the epileptic aura that captures him in the moments preceding a fit. And we have this same kind of idea of a flash, something that happens in an instant that reveals something about the nature of the human condition. But here, contrary to what Leela experiences when she sees her brother at this New Year's party amidst all the fireworks, for her that's a terrifying experience. But for Muishkin, the epileptic aura is quite positive. We have the same idea of the sort of the flash of illumination. So it says his brain seemed to catch fire at brief moments, and with an extraordinary momentum, his vital forces were strained to the utmost all at once. His sensation of being alive and his awareness increased tenfold at those moments which flashed by like lightning. We can see here that it's a positive sensation. So all his agitation, his doubts and worries seem composed in a twinkling, culminating in a great calm, full of serene and harmonious joy and hope, full of understanding and the knowledge of the final cause. But if we just move to the next slide, from the same novel, we have what I think is actually a better analogy to the Smarginatura. It's not so much in terms of the kind of the temporal nature of it coming as a flash, as a moment of illumination, but it is a moment of revelation of this, the sort of the confrontation of the terror and meaninglessness of existence. And this comes at a moment when another character, the young consumptive boy Hippolyte, describes seeing the portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger of the dead Christ in the tomb. You can see a little graphic of it there. It's a very unusual painting, very long, narrow frame representing the body in this very narrow space. And he writes about it like this: looking at that picture, you get the impression of nature as some enormous, implacable and dumb beast, or, to put it more correctly, as some huge engine of the latest design which has senselessly seized, cut to pieces and swallowed up, impassively and unfeelingly, a great and priceless being. So there's that real sense of the shock of the destruction, the dismantling of something that is precious to someone, that we see also in Leela's experience. If I just compare it again to the passage that Olivia mentioned a moment ago, this idea of Leela watching her brother disintegrate, something violated the organic structure of her brother. I think there's a much stronger parallel there of this first-hand knowledge of the terror in Dostoevsky.
Absolutely. And if I mean, it's this panic perception of the meaningless of the world, and this, as you say, this comparison is more appropriate than the previous one that happened in The Idiot. I want to just add that this is in a sense, is the unfiltered. We go back to the unfiltered, the raw material that fiction, good fiction, according to Ferrante, should try to account for. I think it's important to stress that the quotes in this slide's title, the first-hand knowledge of the terror, appears in a passage, we have seen it before, in which Ferrante is discussing not Smarginatura, but what is the aim of fiction, of good fiction. So this reflection on literature, on reading and writing, is constant in Ferrante's works. And perhaps now we can move on to the Napolitan novels and see this reflection on writing, how this is presented in the works of both Dostoevsky and Ferrante. So in the next slides, we see, we have titled the writers at work. Now this reflection on writing in the Napolitan novel appears most frequently, but not only, in the framing chapters. And in this chapter, we find the narrator pausing and turning her attention from the narrated events to the act of narration, from the story, let's say, to the reasons behind her writing her story. And a good example is this passage from the prologue, where Elena declares that she, and now I'm quoting, she began to write after, actually, because of the disappearance of Leela. And by writing, Elena brings Leela back. Also, Elena has her own revenge, telling her own version of the story. So from the very beginning of the Neapolitan novels, we're informed of the symbiotic and competitive nature of this friendship and the pivotal role played by writing. I think we can move on to the next slide.
So yes, I want to draw sort of similar analogies with Dostoevsky and the idea of how the writer also works with this sense of a kind of competitiveness. It's a different kind of competitiveness, though. It's more that Dostoevsky's writer narrators express a constant anxiety over their success, over their ability to write well, and a constant awareness of what their audience, whether it's their real audience or their imagined audience, might be thinking of their work. You know, what would a reader say if I write this? What would somebody who is reading this think? What would they think of me? We've got a wonderful example here from one of Dostoevsky's lesser-known novels, The Insulted and the Injured, in which the narrator is a professional novelist, but not a very successful one. He again here he reflects upon the pitfalls of too much polishing, too much editing. So he's talking about reading a review of his latest novel, in which the commentator, anonymously signed the contributor, says that my compositions on the whole reek of perspiration. That is, I pour over them so much in the way of mending and amending that as a result, it all becomes too much of a good thing. So this idea that, you know, the sort of the anxious and insecure sweat and effort of constantly worrying about the finished polishing effect overall spoils the effect, makes it trite, makes it platitudinous, mawkish, however you want to describe it. Dostoevsky in this novel introduces an interesting concept, which is to do with the idea of what success really means in writing. The subtitle of this novel is From the Notes of an Unsuccessful Belles Lettrist. And it's quite interesting, the word that he uses there, because he doesn't use the standard Russian word for writer. He doesn't use that word, which is pisatel. He uses this word literator, which I'm translating kind of as belles lettrist, because it's a slightly more kind of pretentious word. It's got this ironic connotation, which, you know, suggests that someone who puts too much effort into their writing will be less successful than someone who can write more authentically.
Well, I was also struck by the end of this quote, now when he says exactly too much of a good thing, not this too polished. So Dostoevsky says this as if in writing this could be a problem. And it is certainly a problem. If we move on to the next quote, it is certainly a problem for the two Neapolitan friends. Now, writing fiction, says Elena here in this quote, means to give shape and order to the chaos. It means, and I'm quoting, to pass one fact to another with words so that everything has to seem coherent, even if it's not. So he takes Lila, a brilliant friend, double, to remind her that actually disorder, this coherence is a fiction, is a lie. And that underneath this good thing, there is the void. And I leave the word to you, because we are, the next part is also a comment on this, again, on writing.
Absolutely, yeah. So in Dostoevsky, if we have a look at the next slide, there's this similar idea of trying to produce order out of chaos. And, you know, human life is messy, human life is chaotic, but trying to sort of shape that is not necessarily a good thing. So again, here we've got an extract from The Insulted and the Injured. This is at the start of the novel, where the narrator expresses why he's writing this particular text, the one that we're reading. He's reflecting on some chaotic and tumultuous, traumatic events that have happened to him, and he starts off believing that if he writes them down, it will help him. It will make things better. It will make somehow order out of chaos. So he said, I cannot stop myself constantly recalling the whole of that difficult past year in my life. But he goes on to say, once they've been written down, they will take on a calmer, more orderly aspect. But then we have the sort of the kind of the proviso, which hints towards the fact that Dostoevsky believes that's not really so. He says, well, at least I believe so. But what we see so many times in Dostoevsky is that actually that exercise of writing, trying to bring order to the chaos, the writing is a fiction. It's a lie. It's not it's almost impossible to capture the authentic experience, as Arkady in The Adolescent says in a similar kind of note. Writing it down just makes it cloudy and nightmarish. So it actually doesn't work. There's a reason for this, I think, in Dostoevsky's mind. If we just move on to the next slide, he was very interested in a quotation from a poet who was very successful a couple of decades before Dostoevsky became an established writer, and that is Fyodor Tyutchev. And Tyutchev wrote a wonderful poem called Silentium, in which there's this wonderful line that Dostoevsky really sort of latched onto: a thought once uttered is untrue. It's the quotation at the bottom of the slide there. And so what Dostoevsky, I think, grasped from this phrase, which he turned almost into a kind of a maxim, was that words are an artifice. They are artificial. So art, therefore artistry, should not be too much artistry. Artifice, these words are all related, because part of existence is this chaos, this formless terror underneath. And the word for it in Russian is безобразие. I'm just going to explain this word to you and break it down a little bit. So it comes from the word obraz, which in Russian means form or shape or image. And then the prefix bez is the word, the Russian word for without. So it's without form or without shape or without image. So literally it kind of means formlessness. But there is another side to this word in Russian. It's got this kind of emotive quality of kind of disgrace, something that is emotively and kind of morally bad. You know, if Russians are upset about something, you know, if they think it's awful, they will say, "Oh, безобразие," you know, it's disgraceful. So that's interesting as well, that idea of lacking grace somehow. And Dostoevsky comments on this kind of idea a number of points, particularly again in The Idiot, where we have that painting that so shocks the character of Hippolyte, and who asks this really intriguing question: is it possible to express in an image something that has no image, something that is безобразие, something that is formlessness and disgraceful? So it's really pointing to the idea that writing is literally a fiction. It's a lie.
Which is the title of, if we move on to the next slide, now the lie of writing. I mean, you see here, what you see here, that is again this tension between form and formlessness. Now at stake, in Ferrante's quote, is the double and ambivalent power of writing. I mean, she highlights this. Now, writing can normalize, polish, and reassure, compromising the authenticity of reality, or, as Elena, the character in the quote, grasps in a flash, it can, and I'm reading the quote, imitate the disjointed, anesthetic, illogical, shapeless banality of things. So Elena's book, now they are speaking, this is also, as in Dostoevsky before, we are seeing she's discussing a review of her book. Elena, I mean, the review in this case was also given by the friend, by Lila, but Elena's book was bad, this is the quote, because it was too well organized, too well written, too polished, and therefore not authentic. So this is how fiction becomes a lie, which is not our topic on this slide.
That's right. So Dostoevsky is reminding us several times, in the same way that that Ferrante does, that putting things into words is an artificial exercise. And again, here's yet another example from the adolescent. Perhaps I've done a bad thing in sitting down and writing. Far, far more remains inside than comes out in the words. Your thoughts, though bad ones, are always much deeper, so long as they're with you, but written down, they're much more silly and dishonest. So how do we capture that authenticity? What is the way of doing that in literature? What is the solution to this conundrum? And this, I think, has been identified in Dostoevsky as the concept of polyphony. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see we've got a cover here of the brothers Karamazov, that novel I mentioned earlier. And polyphony was a concept that was identified in Dostoevsky, first of all, by the Russian cultural and literary theoretician Mikhail Bakhtin in his seminal study, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. And he identified in Dostoevsky a plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousnesses, which he called a genuine polyphony of fully valid voices. So in other words, there's no kind of overarching authorial omniscience that stamps a particular point of view or a particular agenda upon all the other voices going on in the novel. And as I mentioned earlier about this novel, it is a very important one about different kinds of stories. So, for example, as I said, each of the characters has a story to tell and tells it. That becomes like a kind of inserted narrative nested within the novel. So Dmitry Karamazov, the eldest brother, he tells the story of his life. He tells the story of how he became involved with his fiancée and the financial obligations that he has to her. Ivan Karamazov, the middle brother, he is the one who's beset by the philosophical doubts about the nature of good and evil. He tells stories about horrendous acts of cruelty to children, and he follows this up with the story that he's created as a kind of answer about the Grand Inquisitor, imagining what would happen if Christ came back to earth in the medieval times at the height of the Spanish Inquisition. What would happen in that circumstance? Alyosha Karamazov, the youngest brother, tells the life of his mentor and his religious guide, Father Zosima. He tells his stories and recounts his teachings and sermons. And then later on in the novel, when Dmitry is accused of the murder of his father, we have a trial, and we have two other kinds of narratives. We have the competing narratives of the prosecution and the defense, each with their own versions of what might or might not have happened, that come into conflict with each other. And Dostoevsky's point here is that how do we know the truth? How do these words reveal the complexity of this family's relationship between the brothers and their father, and everything that has gone on leading up to this point? So this is the kind of the way of overcoming this issue of the lie of writing.
This is so well said, Sarah, because for Dostoevsky, the way to capture authenticity is polyphony. And I add that the same can be said for Ferrante. If we move to the next quote, you can see that now the first sentence: the eye is a crowd with a large quantity of heterogeneous fragments tossing about inside. I won't read the rest of the quote. We have seen it before, but note the last sentence when Ferrante speaks of the secret voices. So I just want to say that the debt to Dostoevsky as the inventor of the polyphonic novel is openly acknowledged, articulated here, now in this quote. What we can do next, I think, for Ferrante is to see how Ferrante recreates a polyphony of voices in the Neapolitan novels. And this is the next quote. So in next quote, I will read the passage. "I wish she were here," says Elena, not the narrator. "That's why I'm writing. I want her to erase, add, collaborate in our story." So the narrator is not Elena, it's Elena and Lila. Writing is a collaboration between the one who writes to bring order, to make sense of the world, and the one who opens abysses, who points at the magma underneath. So one needs the other, they both need each other. No? So what matters is their collaboration. And if you see the second quote, in the second quote, Ferrante states this clearly. No? She says, "Together, Lenou and Lila are the ones that best capture me." And ahead, it is in the movement that characterizes their relationship, in the self-discipline of the one and the unruly imagination of the other. So that is why this is a dual narration, no? In a truly Dostoevskian fashion, I would say. We can now move on to the next slide.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is to create a different kind of polyphony by bringing together Elena Ferrante's most recent novel, The Lying Life of Adults, and Dostoevsky's novel, The Adolescent, probably one of his lesser known and less studied novels, but the one which, in my opinion, is closest to Ferrante's style. It's probably the most chaotic of Dostoevsky's novels, and one with the greatest contrasts in style, linguistically, in terms of the narration, and also I think because the narrators, both first-person narrators of these novels, are young people on the threshold of adulthood. It makes for a really interesting comparison. So Olivia is going to kick us off by just looking at the opening passage of The Lying Life of Adults.
Yes, I will read the opening because it contains many of the themes we have discussed so far, but also many of the themes dear to Ferrante in the Neapolitan novels. So Naples, the unreliable narrator, the smarginatura, no, see that slipped away. And of course, the reflection on writing. So I will read the quote. She says, 2 years before leaving home, my father said to my mother that I was very ugly. The sentence was uttered under his breath in the apartment that my parents, newly married, had bought at the top of Via San Giacomo dei Capri in Rione Alto. Everything, the spaces of Naples, the blue light of a frigid February, those words remain fixed. But I slipped away. And I'm still slipping away with these lines that are intended to give me a story, while in fact I'm nothing of my own, nothing that has really begun or really been brought to completion, only a tangled knot. And nobody, not even the one who at this moment is writing, nobody knows if it contains the right thread for a story or is merely a snarled confusion of suffering without redemption. So the last enigmatic lines reformulates not the tension between writing order, not the right thread, and writing chaos, the snarled confusion. One thing is certain. I've said that the passage is enigmatic, but one thing is certain. Writing cannot bring consolation, can never redeem the suffering, the hidden terror. So let's start the parallel with Dostoevsky by stating the obvious, something that Sarah has already said, the fact that both texts have adolescent protagonist and narrator. So the next slide.
Okay, so here on the next slide, we can see quotations from both texts, but I'll just talk a little bit about The Adolescent. So this is very much a story about the search for oneself. It's about coming of age, and this is, in this novel, it's very much connected with the figure of Arkady's father. Now, Arkady is an illegitimate child. His mother was a young serf girl married to a much older serf on the estate of a landowner. The landowner comes, seduces the serf girl and takes her away from her husband, and Arkady is born, and other children are born. Arkady has never really got to know his biological father. He also hasn't really ever got to know his legal father. So he's mainly been brought up in the care of relatives. And so his biological father appears on the scene, invites him to St. Petersburg to finds him a job, and wants to get to know him. And so we have this moment of awakening through getting to know the father. It's true that the appearance of this man in my life, for an instant in my early childhood, delivered the fateful jolts from which my entire consciousness began. And he wants to know who his father is. He hears lots of competing rumors about him, and he has his own vision of what he wants his father to be. It turned out that this man was only an illusion of mine, a daydream left over from childhood. I'd invented him, but in fact, he turned out to be someone else who had fallen far short of my fantasies about him. So it's Arkady's search for his father, but it's also his search for himself, for his actual and I suppose in a way, his metaphorical illegitimacy. So what would Olivia like to tell us about the narrator of The Lying Life of Adults?
Yeah. Yes. So the Lying Life of Adults is also clearly it's a classic coming of age story. No, we have this Giovanna rebelling against the parents and becoming an adult, or on the verge of becoming an adult. The relationship with the father is very important, and in fact is maybe one of the novelties of this book in comparison with other novels by Ferrante, where in fact the relationship is more with the mother. No, so this is a novelty of the last book of Ferrante. What I want to highlight now, because is that see the quote. I won't read the whole quote, but I want to point out that the crisis experienced in adolescence is here by Ferrante described with words that are pretty similar to the experience of smarginatura. See, now the something somewhere in my body broke. And then later, I felt as if I were a container of granules that were imperceptibly leaking out of me through a tiny crack. So I want to move to the next quote to see why an adolescent narrator really affects the whole story and the whole world of this book. So if we move out to the next quote, we see that what happens here, we have entitled this a constantly shifting point of view, because this is what happens in both texts. No? So let's say that coming from the Napolitan novel, we can say that the dual narrative of the Napolitan novels is here supplanted by a single voice, no? That of the ugly child, no? The adolescent protagonist, Giovanna Trada. But there is a Giovanna before the event that marked the end of her childhood, and the Giovanna who writes the story afterwards, the one that has gone through and come out of the trauma. Now, this constantly changing point of view is the most intriguing feature of this novel. And I think also Sarah might agree with the adolescent. So the reader's views, no, our views as readers also become mobile and unsettled following the undulating motion of Giovanna's mind when she starts her mission of spying. I'm using a word that she often uses, spying on her parents, spying on the world around her. So our perception of the parents, of Vittoria, no, the aunt, of the narrated events, and also of Giovanna herself, changes all the time. No, our opinion. We keep reassessing, rethinking what is good and what is bad, right, wrong, beautiful or ugly. So in these tangled knots, the readers, like Giovanna, she says in this quote, the readers are losing every old orientation. And the word to you, Sarah.
Yeah, so it's the same kind of situation in The Adolescent by Dostoevsky. This idea that the point of view is not stable. It's not constant. This is partly, obviously, because Arkady is growing up, and in much the same way as Olivia mentioned with The Lying Life of Adults, there's the case of the Arkady at the point of the start of the story, compared to the Arkady who has gone through this process of the events of the novel and finds himself a different young man at the point at which he sits down to write the notes about what's happened. And at the same time as well, within the course of that text, as Arkady comes within different kinds of influences, whether that be his biological father, or his legal father, or his mother, or his various half siblings, or the people that he went to school with, various people of all kinds of social statuses interact with him, and temporarily kind of affect his outlook and his view. All of this sort of comes to the end of the text, where the writing process also adds another layer into that constant sort of shifting of the point of view. And it's probably one of the least popular of Dostoevsky's novels, because it is the most chaotic in terms of its narrative. But what Arkady has tried to do through the writing down of his story is to again to impose a kind of form on it. So as he says, I've written these notes always with the aim of imagining myself only too clearly as I was at each instance I was describing. But then he talks about the process of writing as having re-educated himself. And again, the word in Russian for educate is connected with the word for form, obraz, that I mentioned before. So to educate is literally in Russian to form or to shape someone. So by re-educating himself, he has given himself a new shape. He has given himself a new form or a new image. And that's very important, because this text, because of the family situation that Dostoevsky describes, which he refers to as being an accidental family, the family of the illegitimate children of the landowner and the serf girl has come about, not through the kind of the normal social practices. It's an example of this messiness of human nature that the novel is trying to capture, particularly when things like the kind of the traditional nuclear family breaks down. So let's talk now about the those particular different influences that lead to this kind of ambivalence in the text between good and evil. If we move on to the next slide. So I just want to say a little bit more about those different kinds of influences on Arkady. He is his biological father is very much an enigmatic character. Some people talk about him as a debauchee. Other people talk about him as a sort of a selfless philanthropist. Arkady doesn't really know who to believe. He wants to, find out about his father himself. He has various school friends who have a variety of different philosophical and political views that try to influence him, and all the while Arkady as a 19-year-old is grappling with his own burgeoning sexuality, his sexual desire. He falls in love with a very beautiful woman and has to decide how to interact with her. And at the same time, he's trying to be himself, to find himself and speak his own unique, independent word. And I think very much the same kind of thing is going on in The Lying Life of Adults, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the opposition, good and evil, is so important in The Lying Life of Adults. I mean, I think it's important to stress that this is a leitmotif also in the Napolitan novels. Now, starting from the epigraph taken from Goethe's Faust, where the devil is the comrade given to men to keep them searching, never satisfied, but also to show men that good and evil are inextricably tied together. So in the lying life of adults, there is a great attention to good and evil. Now, this is clearly, at least to me, linked to the adolescent perceptive. And Giovanna, the protagonist, the narrator, ponders constantly this opposition, showing how subjective and how porous it is. And here in the quote, you have the father. This is the father who says that good becomes evil without you realizing it. But I mean, it's interesting to know that he was trying to explain his own reasons for giving the bracelet to his lover instead of the daughter. Now, the opposition, good and bad, at the beginning shapes even the topography of the city. If we can move on to the next slide, you can read the city with this opposition. So the city, Naples. In Naples, everything is socially and linguistically stratified. Considered in this particular novel, consider the dividedness of the family, the two Naples, up and down Vomero, where the Neapolitan middle class lives, speak a polite Italian, and Pascone, the bleak industrial neighborhood where dialect is spoken. There are even two sets of characters for the two parts of the city. And I think it's interesting to know that whereas in the Neapolitan novels, Elena, the narrator, is the social climber, who leads the neighborhood, and Naples, in fact, at the end. In the lying life of adults, Giovanna, the protagonist, does the opposite. Here, hers is a journey, you see the quote, into the depths of Naples, into the forbidden dialect. And their guide is this Vittoria, the repudiated aunt, a childhood bogeyman, she's also described in the novel, whose face, and I'm quoting because it's particularly important, because she says, the face seemed so vividly insolent that it was very ugly and very beautiful at the same time. Now, to you, Sarah.
Yeah. So in the Adolescent, Dostoevsky's novel, the portrayal of St. Petersburg, I think, is the most contrasting that we see in all of Dostoevsky's novels set in St. Petersburg. So many of them have St. Petersburg as a setting, but whereas, for example, in Crime and Punishment, we tend to see only the sort of the lower social circles of St. Petersburg. And in The Idiot, we see mainly the high society of St. Petersburg. In The Adolescents, we see both of them. We see them intermingled. And again, this is to do with this kind of ambiguity, this kind of swinging and shifting between the polarities of good and evil. So in The Adolescent, Arkady is first of all brought to St. Petersburg to work as a kind of secretary for an elderly prince, and so he's introduced into the high society of St. Petersburg, the company of princes. But then there are the kinds of seamier side of St. Petersburg, where some of his old school friends, with their more radical political views, are now frequenting drinking dens, gambling dens, and places where people indulge in all kinds of vice. And Arkady is the go-between, just as Giovanna is the go-between in the different areas of Naples, and the go-between between the warring elements of the family. So Arkady is the go-between between the different sections of St. Petersburg and the sort of the competing rivals for the financial and the emotional attention of different prominent characters. So just as in The Lying Life of Adults, there is this symbolic object, the bracelet, that Giovanna's aunt says should have been given to her, and why wasn't it, and all the sort of the story behind that, of the intricate problematic relationships between those families. So in The Adolescent, we have a document written by this beautiful woman. She's a young widow, and she wrote this at a time when she thought her father might be might be starting to suffer from dementia, and she wrote this letter to a solicitor asking, could he be placed perhaps under court supervision? And then the father recovers from himself, and she doesn't want him to discover that she wrote this letter, because if he found out that she had those doubts about him, he might disinherit her. And so there's this compromising document that falls into Arcadi's hands, and different people want to use it as a tool to manipulate both him and the young widow. And he goes between the different societies holding this symbolic object, that can influence the relationships between the characters in a very similar way as happens in the lying life of adults. But what this also points to, I think, is the sense of the depths of society, and not just in terms of the sort of the social aspect, in terms of the poorer areas of society, but also the depths in terms of the morality, which Dostoevsky referred to as the underground. So if we move on to the next slide, I just want to develop this idea of the underground a little bit. One of Dostoevsky's earlier works, Notes from Underground, which is often considered to be not just an interesting work of fiction, but a sort of important philosophical essay as well, in which he really does try to grasp this idea of almost existential anxiety of the human condition, which for Dostoevsky really characterizes this concept of the underground, those lower depths of the human psyche, of the human soul. But for Dostoevsky, this underground aspect is what is most important. It links back to everything that we've been saying about the first-hand knowledge of the terror, about revealing those moments where we confront the meaninglessness of existence, and where somehow something authentic comes out of that, which is very difficult to represent in words, but that can be done through collaboration, through polyphony, through a multitude of voices, where sort of overlapping the sense of the authenticity will eventually emerge. Here is what Dostoevsky said himself about this concept of the underground, responding in the way that he did, so conscious about the voice of critics, responding to what critics sort of tended to reprimand him about in his writing. He says, "I alone have revealed the tragedy of the underground, consisting in suffering, self-castigation, awareness of the highest and the inability to attain it, and chiefly in the firm conviction of these unfortunate people that everyone is like this, but there's seemingly no point in trying to improve. What could support those trying to improve themselves? Rewards? Faith? There are no rewards from anyone, no faith in anyone. Just one step from here and you find the most extreme debauchery and crime, murder. Underground, underground, poet of the underground. The feuilletonists repeat this about me as if it was something derogatory. Fools, this is my glory, for therein lies the truth." And I think it's very much like what Ferrante is trying to do, isn't it, Olivia, in this idea of the depths of experience?
Absolutely. But first, what a fantastic quotation from Dostoevsky. I'm always blown away. I mean, it's a great quotation. And yes, I agree. Ferrante too wants to capture the underground. Now, let's remember, you see the quote there. Let's remember that writing is pulling up what is under, the unfiltered element, the unbearable, she calls it. So pulling up from the depths of her experience, indeed. So since we're at the end, I might launch myself into a fanciful last parallel and suggest that what Ferrante has done, or what Ferrante is doing, is transform what Dostoevsky calls here in this passage, tragedy of the underground, into the tragedy of 21st century women under the patriarchy. Yes, because Ferrante says in one of her interviews that we are still in the thick of the battle. So the battle, she says in the passage in the next slide, the last slide, is, and I'm quoting, with the raw material of our experience as women, not only because all her female characters experience the underground, and because of that, they are survivors and not victims, but also because Ferrante turns writing into a militant activity. The dissatisfaction, anxiety. Sarah said many interesting things on the anxiety of Dostoevsky's narrators, and the similar anxiety pervades the last volume of the Napolitan novels. So the dissatisfaction that the narrators of Ferrante and Dostoevsky experience as writers in their constant battle with the raw material, to keep the authenticity in spite of the order, the embellishment, the simplification of fiction, this dissatisfaction acquires here a gender dimension, becomes a systematic dissatisfaction, you see in the quote, that of a woman writer battling with the male literary tradition. I'm just taking bits and pieces from the quote, comparing ourselves to giants. The woman writer not only must know the tradition thoroughly, and she does, and Ferrante's homage and reuse of Dostoevsky is a brilliant example. So the woman writer must not only know the tradition thoroughly, but she also needs to learn to reuse it, bend it as needed, in order to create what she says at the very end of the quote, a literary genealogy of our own.
And I think I'm going to have to interrupt you there and thank you both, because we've almost out of time for the first hour, but thank you very much, both Sarah and Olivia, for that fascinating discussion. And we're going to stop this pre-recorded bit in a moment and then move on to questions, but I'm just going to make a few points as a bridge to let Sarah and Olivia get their breath back as well, and then before we move into any questions from the audience. I think what's particularly interesting about what you've done by juxtaposing these two writers in front of us is almost putting them in the present tense for us at the moment. So we see these first-person narrators, these are writers themselves, with bits of dialogue in front of us, and how we see these people going through similar experiences and attempting to make sense of them. And I'm just going to mention a few things that we might want to think about for the discussion. The first thing is the notion of influence. Of course, we've seen how Ferrante is specifically influenced by Dostoevsky. But we can also put that, turn it on its head. The French critic Pierre Bayard wrote a provocative book a while ago called Plagiarism by Anticipation. And it's a sense, it's not just a one-directional form of influence. The idea is, to what extent is Dostoevsky actually plagiarizing Ferrante? How is Dostoevsky, in fact, anticipating what Ferrante is going to be doing that several centuries down the line? I'd also like to come back to that last point about gender here. What's particularly interesting, how you ended on Ferrante's lesson from Dostoevsky and this sense of what that's particularly like for a women writer. To what extent, again, we might be able to challenge that and say, can we go beyond questions of gender when we're just thinking about consciousness in terms of making sense of experience? Of course, this experience always has to be contextualized, but is there a way in which we can see Dostoevsky and Ferrante merging at a point perhaps before gender? I like us perhaps to think also about the notions of belief, the importance of belief for Dostoevsky. What does belief mean for Ferrante? And the final question perhaps is to do with style. It's very interesting, Sarah, how you showed, of course, the polyphony in Dostoevsky's novels and how Olivia took that point up, thinking about these different voices within the first person, within the writer. And again, this links back to this question of gender, but also how the two voices within the self are actually conveyed in the novels through the two girls themselves. So they're kind of a counterpoint to one particular voice. And the final thing, I think, is about a question about style, because what's interesting of bringing these two particular writers together, you've got obviously a 19th century novelist, and here we have a contemporary novelist, and we have all this modernist literature in between, and what role that sense plays in terms of experimentation, in terms of experimenting with syntax, for example, what it is about Ferrante going back to Dostoevsky in this particular example, rather than going back, say, to Proust or to Joyce or to Woolf or to other writers. So perhaps those are some of the things that we can think about. But of course, we welcome other questions from the audience. And I think it's time for us to stop now. So thanks very much for listening so far.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. This obviously starts our second session of the event. So this is the live Q&A. And as you've seen, we've got some question and answers which you can send in to us, which I'm going to be able to see on my screen. And I've already seen a couple coming in. Thanks very much for following the event so far, and thanks for the captions that were given. You might have seen an interesting moment of censorship on one of those captions. It came out as indistinct when Olivia said about the devil being a comrade. That was the word which was interestingly censored, about it coming from Goethe's Faust. But we thought we'd start with the last of the questions which we ended with, and that will give the audience time, if they'd like perhaps to think of some questions and put them into the chat function. So this first question we're going to think about is this question about why Ferrante goes back to Dostoevsky, goes back to the 19th century. And perhaps, Olivia, if you'd like to start by answering that one.
Thank you, Richard, for the question. First, I want to say that Ferrante has a wide literary culture. I mean, she speaks of literary tradition as a large depository where anyone who wants to write goes to choose what is useful to them. So she does mention Virginia Woolf, she mentions Proust, but perhaps not as much as Dostoevsky and Flaubert. So this is interesting. And I must say that, I must confess that this was what brought me to Ferrante. I usually work on 19th century novel. And when I read the Neapolitan novels, I was, I must say, blown away, because I really saw a revival of the 19th century novel. I love the way Ferrante, it seemed to me that Ferrante revisits and brought new energy to the novel, with, yes, a postmodern and contemporary twist, particularly for the strong metafictional element, that reflection on writing that we have seen in our conversation. So Ferrante, for me, brings the novel back to its origin as that hybrid genre, in which high and low art are happily fused together. So a middle-brow genre, but also a genre that keeps reflecting on itself, as the Neapolitan novels do very well. I hope we have seen. Perhaps Sarah wants to say something about this.
Yes, absolutely. I would also add that I think it might not be so surprising to sort of feel like Ferrante is skipping over a large swathe of modernist literature to return to the 19th century novel, because I think in the case of Dostoevsky, I think actually he shares a lot of features with some of the modernist writers, particularly this idea of the sort of the self-reflexiveness of writing and the way that discourse interferes with the message, and the kind of, the focus on the nature of discourse as this kind of problematic concept. So in actual fact, I think there's a more of a continuity there than might initially be apparent, and I think Dostoevsky is in many ways ahead of his time, I think, in terms of his kind of preoccupations with regard to narrative and discourse.
Thanks very much. And I think you're right. And obviously some of these period distinctions, obviously they're always relative, aren't they, in terms of thinking about these continuums. I'm going to move to our first question from the audience, and it's a really interesting one. So thanks for this. And we can see this on our screen. And it says, I wonder if we can consider Gary Saul Mawson's idea of boundary genres, which involving joints and semi-fiction forms in Dostoevsky's A Writer's Diary and so on, in Dostoevsky, as a sort of smaginatura, perhaps, at the level of genre. Would that work? Sarah, would you like to try and answer that one first, and then Olivia?
Absolutely, yes. Great to mention Mawson's work there. He's done some really interesting work on looking at how a lot of Dostoevsky's writing doesn't really easily fit into generic categories, and the way that Dostoevsky was very experimental with his forms, and I think that's That's actually a really good way of thinking about it, that kind of overlapping and that kind of blurring of generic boundaries can be considered a kind of smarginatura, because in that kind of explosion of the conventions of different literary forms, we get that revelation of what's really underneath, of the of the authenticity. And so I think that could definitely be a great way of thinking about it.
Thank you. And I think we're going to go on directly to our next question, which is, it says, great job in joining up two of my favorite authors who I've not thought of together in this way. What about the differences? So there is an open question, if ever there was one. I don't know, Olivia, would you like to start thinking about differences? Or Sarah, whoever would like to have an answer about that one first?
First, I agree, it's a great question, because it's something that also Sarah and I started to think about while we were doing our conversation. So one thing that we highlighted was the flash of illumination, that at first we thought that the smarginatura and the epileptic moment in Dostoevsky could share similarities, but then we realized that actually that was not the case, and Sarah explained very well the way in which this is a different experience. Perhaps I wonder, Sarah, if you want to say something about how I mean, that in Dostoevsky was at the beginning smarginatura, let's say it's a kind of positive experience, but then it turns into something that is really more the first-hand knowledge of the terror. So we discuss a lot about this because there are certainly differences. The other thing, maybe it's the obvious thing, is the fact that the writer in Dostoevsky is always a man, I think, isn't it? While in Ferrante, clearly here, gender is Ferrante is talking, is writing, is the story of a woman writer, and all the problems, the challenges that this still, a woman writer still has today.
Yeah, I think that's actually the clearest, most obvious difference, is that in Dostoevsky, it is usually the men that undertake these kind of soul-searching explorations, and do so through the medium of writing. There are some female characters who articulate concerns with with good and evil, and with the human condition, with existence, but it's only the male characters who actually try to explore that and try to unravel it through the process of narrating a story. So I think that's the main difference, is probably the focus on the male writer rather than the female writer in Dostoevsky.
Would you like to say anything about the notion of the first-person narrator in this particular context of similarities and differences? Because I'm thinking, of course, of first-person narrators in Dostoevsky in texts such as Notes from the Underground, but also I'm wondering about some of the other uses, the more conventional uses of dialogue in some of the longer novels. Would you see that as a similarity, or would you see that as a difference between the two authors, or is that too simplistic a way of looking at it?
I think the first person narrative in Dostoevsky is certainly compared to the Neapolitan novels, it's much more kind of elusive, in that very often it seems like it's a first person narrative, but then the relationship between the narrator and the text that they're narrating slips away and goes backwards and forwards. So for example, one of Dostoevsky's shorter novels, The Gambler, starts off in a kind of a diary form, and the narrator is saying, oh, today this happened to me, and then a passage of time elapses, and you realize, several days have gone by, and then even more time elapses, and you realize that actually it's become almost like a memoir, and he's looking back on something that happened several months ago. I think there's greater consistency in Ferrante, although of course there are the passages where the narration kind of passes to Leela. So maybe that's not really the right way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it's a question of balance, isn't it? It's a tricky question. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Olivia.
I mean, no particular, in the sense, in Ferrante is every novel by Ferrante is written with this in first person. It's a really I think it's a trademark in a sense. It's this confessional style. This is something that really has, in a sense, shortened the distance between the reader and the writer. No? So if I want to say something else about this, I think that perhaps is one of the as Sarah said before, Dostoevsky was anticipating some of the modernist writers. And I think particularly the first person of Dostoevsky, I think is really what is striking, particularly for his period. So what, I'm not saying unique, but for the 19th century, certainly very extraordinary, and is and then has the same effect of abridging the gap between the reader and the text. So I mean, I want to stop it here. I mean, I just want to say something that when you were talking, there was a comment by an Italian director that made the film the Days of the Abandonment, and who said this. He said that Ferrante speaks of you, not only to you. And in this sentence, I think that he encapsulated the strength of Ferrante. This quite direct. He's speaking of you, so not only to you. And so I think that this is a good definition of what Ferrante does.
Thank you. I've got two more questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with this one for you, Olivia, in fact, and then to Sarah. Is there any 20th century writer, or are there any 20th century writers who you would consider as a bridge between Ferrante and Dostoevsky?
Well, to me, it's an author that is in between, and at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, is the Italian Sibilla Leramo. And she has the same, is the same as a story in first person, and also is the first feminist novel of the Italian tradition. And I think that this is, I would say it's a powerful comparison with the Ferrante, and a bridge in a sense.
Thank you. Sarah, how about you? Any particular names stand out from the 20th century as a bridge?
Yes, I would recommend the Russian author Lyudmila Petrushevskaya. Her works have been translated into English, and there's a great novella called it's translated as The Time Night, but it's one of those kind of Russian titles that don't easily translate. It's just kind of time, night, night, time. It's not really clear which way around the two nouns should go. But anyway, this novel, The Time Night, is a very chaotically written narrative, first-person narrative by a female protagonist, and it's again very much to do with this messiness of human relationships. A woman who is a struggling writer herself. She has a very difficult relationship with her two grown-up children, and she also has an elderly mother who she needs to put into care, and it's about the stresses and strains of her life, her financial struggles, trying to negotiate around 20th century Moscow. She was writing it in the just at the sort of the turn of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the the change into the post-Soviet period. So she's from that late period of perestroika, and the very early post-Soviet period is when some of her best-known works were written. She's still writing today, and I think actually she connects a lot of those points that we've seen today.
Thank you. There's actually a question specifically for you, and this you'll be pleased to hear is a relatively easy one, I hope. For those who have never read Dostoevsky before and who are slightly intimidated by reading his works, which would you recommend readers start with? Or are there any other authors who would be a good introduction or a step towards reading Dostoevsky, the type of gateway drug, perhaps? I want to start with Dostoevsky.
Oh no, you want to go straight into the Class A Dostoevsky, absolutely. Yes, I would say probably Crime and Punishment. In my view, it's got that unputdownable sort of gripping nature that you really want, and you know, this was the novel that gripped me. This was the novel that really took me by the scruff of the neck as a student, and you know, I couldn't do anything else but read this novel, and I went around almost like Raskolnikov, the protagonist of the novel, looking over my shoulder, wondering, you know, who was going to leap out at me from a dark corner. It sort of obsessed me so much, and you know, the opening scenes of this novel of this murder. I'm not giving anything away by saying it's a murder novel. You know, this murder happens. I never expected to read such a graphically described murder in a 19th century novel. And I think absolutely it's the most fast-paced of Dostoevsky's novels. It's the most wonderful, intriguing storyline, the most engaging characters. I would definitely go with Crime and Punishment first.
Thank you, Sarah. And there's a question actually, I can start with you, this one, which you might have answered partly, which is, what initially drew you both to studying these authors? So in your case, it might be you had to do it because it was compulsory at university, or is that the right answer?
I'd picked a literature module at university that included Dostoevsky and other 19th century authors like Chekhov and Tolstoy, and out of all of them, it was just that experience of reading Crime and Punishment, and I thought, you know, I have to do more of this. I can't stop. I must continue. So,
how about you, Olivia? What you said obviously Ferrante was different from what you work on. What drew you to pick up Ferrante in the first place?
Well, I think I arrived to Ferrante a little bit in the middle of the Ferrante fever, but I don't usually work on contemporary literature. I work on the 19th century. But then when I started reading the Napolitan novels, I found that I was reading the topic I researched in the 19th century is the representation of reading. The woman reader in the novels in the 19th century, like Madame Bovary, Flaubert, in the Italian context. And I found a book, actually 4 books, that were all about reading and writing. So I found my theme in Ferrante, and I really had to then leave the 19th century for a little while. And yes, I had to write of Ferrante, because even if I felt that it wasn't really, you know, simply that I started writing on Ferrante because of the similarity on my research topic, the representation of reading.
And I think what's interesting about that answer is that some way we move beyond thinking in terms of period and thinking of theme and particular approach. I do wonder about gender. I'd like to challenge you slightly on your final slide, Olivia, when you were talking about gender and the genealogies of reading. I wonder or writing, I wonder in a way whether the answer to Ferrante is, when you look at Dostoevsky, when you're thinking about the actual process of forming consciousness into language, of course that's contextualized by gender, but can we argue to some way there is a process of writing which happens before gender becomes a factor?
Certainly, I mean, this is a good question. I have to say something about Ferrante, though. That's I didn't start reading Ferrante I mean, I don't work on gender studies, for example. So and you have seen, I arrived to Ferrante because of this metafictional dimension. But then I must say that reading Ferrante, I think that male and female readers have to finish reading the Napolitan novels, and really, I think that the gender issue is really paramount. I mean, I think that by reading the Napolitan novels, you experience the kind of the misogyny that is still in our society. So in this sense, I think that Ferrante, it's, you know, writing becomes in Ferrante, reading Ferrante, male, female, you really need to acknowledge the gender inequality that is still in our society. So
no, I think I'd agree with you, certainly from that point of view in terms of the content. I'm just looking at, we've got a few more minutes, and we've got one more question from the audience coming here. And I'm very pleased, it was one that I had up my sleeve in case we needed another one. It's about faith. And of course, we know about the importance of faith for Dostoevsky. But this question is interesting. It's the thoughts on both faith and revelation in both authors. It seems that in Ferrante, revelation is often negative, e.g. Smarghi, Natura, and Neapolitan novels, or the scene in the lying life of adults in which Giovanna reads the Gospels for the first time. But this is not necessarily true in Dostoevsky. Perhaps, Olivia, would you like to say a few words about what faith means to Ferrante, in your opinion, and then we'll give the final word to Sarah.
Well, it's difficult to answer this question because Ferrante in the Frantumalia explicitly says that since she was 15, she doesn't, at least what she says is that she doesn't believe in God. But it's true that in the Napolitan novels, and particularly in the life of adults, the religion is much more important, at least in the life of adults. So I mean, it's difficult for me to say what is a position in relation to religion. And perhaps I wonder if Sarah on Dostoevsky is more, this is a more studied area. So maybe I don't know if Sarah has something to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about Dostoevsky's perspective there, and thank you to the person that's asked this question, particularly by highlighting this idea of faith and revelation, because both are present in Dostoevsky, but neither are straightforward. And I think you phrased that well in your question by saying it's not necessarily true in Dostoevsky. Faith is something that Dostoevsky acknowledges both in his, in his autobiographical writings and in his fiction. Is not a straightforward solution. It's difficult and problematic, particularly when we're faced by the messiness and the horror of human behavior. It's very hard to have faith in those circumstances. But what we gradually see, I think, in Dostoevsky is rather than moments of revelation that are sort of provide almost like an easy solution, you get the idea of a kind of a more pragmatic approach to it, of coming at faith through love. That if you are able to love, if you are able to love an individual, then you are able to start perceiving the kind of the benefices that faith would give you, and you kind of access it that way. So there's a kind of revelation there, but it's actually quite prosaic, which is another term that's used by Mawson, who was mentioned earlier. It's a kind of a prosaic way of coming to it.
Thank you very much, and for wonderful timing as well. I'm sorry we've got to stop because another very interesting question has come in about gender, and I know that the organizer of the festival will tell us if we do have to wrap up, but the question is, would you not consider Dostoevsky's narrative voice somewhat stereotypically feminine if we think that indecisiveness is feminine versus, say, the masculine one of Tolstoy?
Do you want to go, Olivia, or shall I go?
I think it's better if, I mean, consider it's Dostoevsky.
Okay. That's a really interesting way of thinking of it. I would never have thought of it like that. I think definitely if you want to talk about Tolstoy's voice, which is very very monological, we've talked about polyphony. Tolstoy's voice is kind of the opposite of that. It's very, it's very overarching. He imposes his perspective, his overarching view, much more sort of authoritatively than Dostoevsky does. I can certainly see that feels kind of masculine. Whether Dostoevsky's voice, therefore, the sort of the indecisiveness, the multiple looks, is that feminine? It's certainly a contrast. It's certainly the opposite. Is it the opposite in terms of gender? I don't really know, but it's a great way of thinking of it.
I think we're going to have to leave it on that question and that answer, but thank you very much for all of the questions, and thanks very much for everybody who's come along and watched and listened today. We really appreciate it. And of course, we need to thank both Sarah and Olivia for setting up this dialogue. And finally, we need to thank the Ilkley Literature Festival for hosting us and all the colleagues behind the scenes who put this on. So I think it's time for us to say goodnight. We actually have gone into extra time. So time for us to stop. So I wish everybody a very good remainder of the evening, and we look forward to seeing you at another event in the future.
Thank you very much, everyone.